Greetings, Kerbonauts! This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is episode number 31 of Project Odyssey. At the end of the last episode, we had gotten our scanning satellite to the moon, and it's time to let it do its thing all around here, bringing in that wonderful satellite information, that satellite map that shows us where we're going to be able to find our collectible resources. And I've also made a decision. I had to choose between Kethane and Carbonite, and one of the most important factors for me in that decision was I wanted to be able to do a couple things with the map. I wanted to scan while revealing the map a little bit at a time. And Carbonite doesn't do that straight out of the box. You have to have ScanSat for it. Another thing I wanted was the ability to look at those maps later after I've done the scanning, and especially I want to be able to do it pretty much in any situation. Like if you were in real life down on a planet and you had already scanned something, you would look back at those scans and it wouldn't matter where you were. You could be in a meeting room and you'd be able to see those scans, which means to me that I want to be able to see them even if I'm at the tracking station view when I don't have anything selected. You can get a ScanSat view, but you can't get the hotspots, and even with that, you can't get the hotspots on the ScanSat view. As far as whether a resource is depletable or not, it doesn't really matter to me because I can make any resource do anything I want. If I want Kethane to not be depletable, I can make it that way. One other thing I wanted was the ability to use the more interesting parts that come out of the Carbonite mod. I think all of those are just plain prettier, and the drill that comes out of the bottom like a stack mount is much more interesting to me than the radial mounted drills that come out of Kethane. So what's my final answer on this? Will it be Kethane or Carbonite? Neither. I'm making a brand new resource. It's going to be called Kethite, and it is essentially a hybrid of the two ideas. I'll be using the Carbonite parts and maybe some of the Carbonite concepts, but I'll be using Kethane for the harvesting model. I will also not be using the base mass value that either Kethane or Carbonite uses, which is another reason why I want to do my own resource. My intention is to have Kethite be an extremely dense material, almost like a liquid rock of some kind, that we will be able to refine down with only a little bit of loss of mass into a higher volume of fuel and oxidizer as necessary. I think what that might be called is specific density, and essentially means how much propulsion are you able to get out of 1 liter rather than out of the actual mass of whatever the material is that you're talking about. Here in the background, while I'm talking about the new Kethite resource, you can see that I'm experimenting again with that lander that's going to go to the moon. And this time, because I'm not using 64-bit KSP, I think we should have a much better time of not having everything explode. And this is going to be fun. I really love setting up these sort of moon-based type things with the little parts all around, all connected together, and habitation centers, and life support systems, power generation, Kethite resource drilling, all that good stuff. So obviously the little crane rover lander thing here still needs a little bit of work because look how much it's tipping over right here. So I need to weigh it down a little bit, maybe put something on the back side of it, like a Kerbal attachment system, anchor or something that will keep it down. Okay, coming up next, after several hours and considerable effort, we have to go back to the Duna Network. The Duna Network, just as a reminder, is supposed to put up 11 satellites. This is the basic configuration of what I'm looking for right here. But also remember, we have 2 deep space communication satellites that are one at L4 and one at L5 relative to Kerbin, and those are going to be providing the communications to the Duna network of 11 satellites. So the first thing we're going to do here is point ourselves onto that vector that will get us into an orbit that matches Kerbin's orbit, thereby locking us in position around the sun relative to Kerbin up in front, allowing us to bounce our signal through it and around the sun just to make sure that we never lose communication while we're doing this. The deep space comet L4 went around the sun faster and therefore got there first. We'll come back and do L5 once it catches up to its position. For now, we're watching the Duna Network as it gets into position around Duna. We're going to make an initial capture burn and then release the satellites one by one to take up their various positions, all around 3 around Duna. You can see in my image there, 3 around Ike, and 2 that are outside the range of both of them, so that they'll always have a direct line back to one of the deep space communication satellites. All right, now we have ourselves just barely skimming through the upper atmosphere right there, and that's going to allow me to get just a little bit of extra help from Duna's atmosphere as we slow down. I'm going to leave out my solar panels and my dishes there. I really don't think that we're going to get any kind of air resistance that's really going to significantly rip them off or anything like that. So we'll leave those open, and those will hopefully actually provide additional drag that will slow us down a bit and save delta V just in the off chance that I didn't calculate things. I didn't simulate any of this, so I have no idea how well we're going to do in terms of getting all these things into the right positions and having plenty of delta V to put everything where it belongs. Speaking of getting things into the right place, in a moment here we're going to have so many different satellites all traveling at the same time in so many different directions. That picture that I've got in the bottom right hand corner there, we're going to take a look at that and explain where things are supposed to be before we get doing it to have it make a lot more sense. The 2 that are on the outer ring, outside of everything, those are going to be our deep space communications links. Each one has 2 very large communications dishes that will be able to communicate at the 50 gigameter range. You can see the 2 of them right there open on that base satellite. Those are how we've been maintaining communication so far as it is. There will be the second one that will be released, and then we'll have 2 of them. They'll point back to Kerbin, connecting to the L4 and L5 satellites. They also each have 3 other dishes that you haven't seen yet. The first 2 are going to provide links in toward Ike and Duna. We'll have one of them here point toward Ike and in a cone shape rather than in a direct link system, and then the second one will point over to Duna. The third dish will allow them to point at each other. And finally, not shown in the picture, there are 2 scanning satellites. One will be over Duna, one over Ike. They'll be in polar orbits, and the first one's being released right now. You can see the scanner up top. The whole top of the whole launcher, the main satellite, has the 3 scanning satellites. One of them is a backup. It's just in case something goes wrong with one of the first 2. Its inclination right now should be pretty good to cover all of the landing spots that we might want to go to. We're not going to be interested in going up into the snowy caps of the North or South Pole, so that's why we're only covering the middle section here. The scanner is going to be at about 300 kilometers, which is why we had such a low altitude right there. We've just boosted the remainder of all the satellites up into a higher orbit because now we want to release the 3 communication satellites for Duna at about 1,000 kilometers. The first of the 3 is being released now. And if you look in the bottom right corner again, you can see the links here indicate that these will just be communicating back to the deep space relays using the dishes, the little dishes that I have on either side right here. We're opening up the first 2 now. Then we'll release the second one and then the third one, setting them all up ahead of time so that when they do get far away, we won't lose communication with them because all the dishes will already be linked up and they'll be able to talk to each other using the antenna that they have. So with the first 4 satellites away, you can see as we fly by right here, we only have 7 left on the original launcher. We have the 2 deep space, the 3 Ike, and a scanner to take care of. One of them, of course, being the backup. We're not going to count that. So the 3 we just released are now on their own to take care of getting into their own Duna orbits. That leaves our main satellite, the giant one here, to begin its burn to head off for its Ike insertions. Due to Ike's high gravity and close proximity to Duna, it is extremely easy to get into an encounter with it. All I have to do here is boost up the orbit just a little bit, and fairly quickly it's intercepting as Ike quickly swings around one more time. So with a bit of fast forwarding, we can get ourselves into a position here where we can make our correction that brings up the orbit and aligns our new orbit with that of Duna and Ike. Once this is done, we'll be doing the same thing that we did when we had our Duna low orbit. We'll release 3 satellites, and then we'll continue with the main launcher to boost once again until we have an orbit that's outside both of them. The 3 satellites that we'll be releasing to go down around Ike are going to be on their own to get their final orbits. Each one has the exact same configuration as the ones that we're going to Duna. They have the antenna to maintain their local communication, and they have 2 dishes to point out at the deep space ones, which aren't really super deep space since they're just sitting here around the Duna system, but they are our deep space links. We also have 1 scanning satellite that will go into the polar orbit around Ike. I don't have any plans right now for harvesting any of the Kethite, but I figured if we were going to be here anyway, it seemed like a reasonable thing to do to scan around Ike as well. Okay, with everything released now, we're down to just the 3 satellites, and one of them's the backup that we don't need anyway. So we're going to release the upper structure here that had the backup on it. We don't need that. We're going to let that float away, and later I'll find that the thing has actually been captured by Duna, thrown up toward Ike, and then Ike ejects it back out into a solar orbit. So that thing's on its way out, but I don't know that at this point. Right here, I'm only concerned with getting the last 2 deep space ones ready. Now we're going to get into the good stuff, and this is where Kerbal Alarm Clock is going to be the saving grace of this entire project, because there are going to be 10 different maneuver nodes or SOI transitions that we're going to have to be dealing with all at the exact same time. So I'll simply be setting them up and then watching Kerbal Alarm Clock to see what's the one that's coming up next. To make things easier to follow from home, in the bottom right, I'm going to be keeping that image up the whole time, and I will throw the name of the satellite that we are currently working on down into that window. For starters, since we just released one of the deep space links, all of the satellites are now individual, which means we can put up the very first name. Let's just assume this one is Deep Space 1. Remember, DS1's job is to use those 2 giant dishes to communicate back to Kerbin. The 2 little ones that are opening now will communicate to Ike and Duna, and then a slightly larger one on the side is going to open up, and it will connect to Deep Space 2 on the other side in case we need to bounce the signal around Duna. Now previously when this is launched, we didn't look at it in the VAB, and now that you've seen a little bit of what's going on, I think it'll make a lot more sense, so we're going to go into the VAB and take a look at it now. The engine that we used for that initial burn was this Odyssey second stage engine, which has a much higher than normal, for at least my world, vacuum ISP, but then it was compensated for with a much lower atmospheric ISP. This is the same stage that we used once we got to Duna in order to make our initial orbit insertion burns. Also down on here we have our attitude control. These are the only ones that would normally be active until the fairing was released. The black tanks on the side here, which used to be white until I started switching over to the Shakamonkey texture pack, contain the hydrazine for the attitude control thrusters there. I had all of these on structure parts that are visible here. You can see them much better when I pull the engine away. They connect up to the bottom of that fuel tank right there and allowed me to connect something that would stay vertical even though it was going through the engine. Moving our way up here past more lights, we have the communications system, short range, mid range, and the avionics ring, as well as the fairing that will all pull away so that we can look at the satellite itself now. Now we're going to begin at the top. You can see that the entire structure that goes down through the middle here that has all of the satellites attached to it, at the very, very top of it, we had the communications antenna that it was using to link up with all the individual satellites as they were being released. Speaking of as they were being released, let's take a look at all of these. You can see the 3 scanners are up here on the top. Due to the higher power demand of those scanners, you can see those solar panels are a little bit bigger than the ones in the communication satellites down here as well. Those were all connected to these structure pieces here, which were right next to the scanners that were connected to the CPU. You can see that we have more lights, main battery on the other side. I think I have a backup. No, that's actually the backup battery right there. The main battery is this disc one down here. Each of the satellites has its own attitude control thrusters, although in hindsight, I think I would have put a couple more instead of just 2 on there. I think I would have put an extra 2, have a set of 4. There were 2 down at the bottom. You can see them right there as well. There's one on the other side. Here's our hydrazine tanks, although along the way I did have a problem with the hydrazine tanks because for some reason KSP didn't properly symmetry them. One side of the tanks had hydrazine in it and the other side was completely empty as though it had no tank at all. So I had to correct that. And of course these things are all going to have communications antennas and in some cases dishes, like the communication satellites down here have all these dishes as well. So there was that battery and the communications and CPUs, batteries, power, those are all filled with UDMH and N2O, and we have our satellite engines up there all attached to some of those new truss pieces I had been talking about previously. Speaking of which, I will filter everything out. It's in the SPD folder right here. We'll filter everything out and I can take a look at each of those one by one. This is what the base fuel tank from that mod looks like. You can see that it has basic structure around it, piping, fuel tank, oxidizer tank. I used a couple of those down here at the bottom, although mine are tweak scaled, and so I scaled them down a little bit to the proper size of this whole launcher. But this is your basic size right here until you scale it. In the structure tab, there are a variety of different connector pieces. We have the one that has the hex down there, but a circle up top. We have this one with the hex, but a much larger circle. Short hex piece, we have a mid hex piece here with 2 connectors, and we have a large one with 4 connectors. Where's that 6? No, that's 4. This one has flat bits that you can connect things to, and it also comes with a docking port. And this isn't all of the pieces. I trimmed some of them out that I wasn't going to use, but there's more than that, so that's a pretty cool mod. Continuing on with the dissection of the satellites. If we zoom in here a little bit, we can see that all of these are the same communications satellites, 6 of them stacked on top of each other and connected to these flat pieces from the truss segments. I'll just look at this row down here. As I mentioned, it has the 2 dishes and the smaller satellite solar panels. Otherwise, it's similar. We have our backup battery right there, communications, attitude control system, CPU, the bigger battery, UDMH and N2O4, hydrazine, all of that good stuff right in there. Another segment like that. All of that was connected up here to one of those docking ports to unhook that and let float away that structure once we weren't going to need it anymore, which allows us to then get to this satellite right here. So this is one of the satellites that will get released. It's one of the deep space communications links. The large dishes on the side are the 50 gigameter size that go back to the deep space ones near Kerbin. This is the one that's the 50 megameter that connects it to the one down here. Then we have the 25 megameter dishes that allow us to communicate with Duna and with IPE. Each of these satellites is sporting a nifty little backup battery, so you can see that I have that one right there. Or no, actually that is the main battery. The backup battery is the little one right here. Each of these large satellites has so much power demand for those communications, and because we're going to be at Duna where there's less sun, that we therefore have these very large solar panels that stick out here. Hidden in among all of this stuff, you can see that we also have our attitude control up here and here, communications, some more of those black hydrazine tanks along the side, and we have inline radial engines. If we take the top satellite off and we look at the bottom one, you're going to see that it's basically a duplicate of the first one. In fact, I think what I did was I set up the first one, I then put a new part underneath it to create a new root node, and then I duplicated it and just stacked it on top of each other. So in other words, even though we have a bunch of parts still in here, that means that we're essentially done. This is Deep Space Comlink number 2, and that's it. Back at Duna, we had released everything, and this stage is no longer needed. So I'm doing a retro burn that'll bring this orbit down into crashing into Duna. One of my favorite things to do, destroying satellites and deadly reentry. Unfortunately, in this case, I had intended to put a maneuver node to remind myself with Kerbal Alarm Clock that we were reaching that position, and then I was going to go back and look at it and watch it go in and be destroyed. And I guess I forgot to put that maneuver node, and so later I looked back and this thing just didn't exist anymore, so it must have entered and been destroyed when I wasn't looking. Oh, so sad. So to give you the basic idea of the plan, I've brought up my Kerbal Alarm Clock here. This was actually from a couple minutes ago. And this will show us where it is that we need to go for the next few maneuver nodes or SOI changes. First up is the Duna Kethite Scanner. You can see it here as it's getting into position to make its retro burn and capture an orbit. The scanner works best at about 300 kilometers. That's what I set it up for. So we're going to try to put ourselves into a 300 kilometer orbit. However, I run out of liquid fuel too early. So we have to use our monopropellant hydrazine until we can get as low as we can. Ultimately, it turned out to be something like a 300-500 orbit. The scanner seems to be functioning. As you can see here, it's beginning to trace out a little path, and there's even a little bit of kethite showing up on the map. So next we need to see where to go to now. Here's a good view of the 3 Duna satellites as they're coming into position, one after the other. As you saw in Kerbal Alarm Clock, we're going to be going to each of those and doing retro burns to bring them into lower orbits, one after the other here. Duna 1 will come in first, and it'll go into a relatively low orbit. Duna 1 will come in first and go into a 1 million kilometer orbit. Duna 2 and 3 will go into progressively higher orbits so that as they go around the planet, one of them will be a little bit slower than Duna 1, and it will go into an orbit 2 hours behind that, and then Duna 3 will be even higher and come in 2 hours behind that, and that way, as they each do their retro burns, they're going to be able to set up different positions in sort of a triangle around Duna to provide full wraparound communications. Kerbal Alarm Clock says that the next thing up is going to be the Ike Kethite Scanner. So we've switched over to that one, and that one is also going to try to go into a 300 by 300 kilometer orbit. In this case, there's a lot more fuel available because Ike is a little bit smaller than Duna, which means we don't need as much to do our retro burn here. And it's therefore quite easy to capture that orbit that I'm looking for. Once again, this orbit is going into a sort of polar, but really not too worried about the poles themselves orbit, so that we can get all of around the middle part there, the part that we actually might want to land on someday, to see if that's where there's any kethite that we could collect. Since it's a lot easier to land on Ike than it is on Duna, that could be a good place to do any kind of refueling. But before we can use it for refueling, we need to know its chemical makeup. So while we wait for the Ike and Duna satellites to get into place, let's take another look at kethite. The chemical formula I have decided on for it is C3H10N6O7. Real kethane was too light, defined to be 2 kilograms per liter, and carbonite was too heavy at 12.5 kilograms per liter, which is denser than lead. I've decided on a nice round 3 kilograms per liter, and that should make it more effective to carry around the kethite and take it to a converter than it is to convert on the site and carry the resulting fuels. And that's one of the things I'm interested in, is having something like a converter space station up around the planet where you go down and you take the kethite and you lift it up to the converter that's in station, and then you convert there because it's more efficient to store it as kethite than it is to store it as the fuel. This should be possible because the volume to mass ratio is going to be so good with the kethite. The conversion I'll be doing most of the time, I'm guessing, since it's the primary fuel used on a trip to Duna or something like that, is to have it into UDMH and NTO. I looked up the chemical formulae for those and then calculated the conversion rate, and it's looking right now like my conversion efficiency will be about 97.5%. So I can turn 1 liter of kethite into more than 2.5 liters of hypergolic fuel. Also, with the chemical formula being composed of the 4 basic elements of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, I can come up with other conversion rates for kethite into any useful resource, including water, methane, liquid hydrogen, breathable or liquid oxygen, hydrazine, and of course the hypergolics of UDMH and NTO. So Deep Space One just made a maneuver to put its apoapsis out at its final position where I expect it to be for the remainder of its life. It still needs to boost up its apoapsis, so while we're waiting for it to come around, I decided I would switch over and take a look at the map unfolding of the Kethite as Duna gets scanned. Now this is something I actually enjoy doing. I like watching as it goes by and it uncovers the map, especially watched back at the higher speed like you can see right here where it quickly unfolds. I know there are proponents of carbonite who say that they don't like doing that or they want it to be able to scan in the background, but this really doesn't bother me at all since I like to watch it work. So the goal right now is to get Deep Space 1 and 2 on opposite sides of Duna, and if I were more patient then I would simply wait for the phase to get right, but I have enough fuel and I'm not patient. So what I'm going to do is change the orbit so that we go a little bit slower. You can see here now that Deep Space 2 is going to be coming around much slower as it swings around on the far side. At first it looks like it's getting closer to the other satellite, but then as it comes around through its apoapsis it goes much slower again, and that way when we get down here to the other side and I reorient that orbit back to where it belongs, it's on the opposite side of the first satellite, and so now I have them where I want them. In the middle of waiting for those, the second deep space communications satellite going around in Kerbin's orbit at L5 has finally caught up to where it belongs. Since it was in a larger orbit, it was going slower, and that means we now need to drop that down to match Kerbin's orbit, and that will keep us in the same position behind Kerbin, exactly where we want to be, so that we can jump that signal around to the other side and reach Duna. With the orbit of DSC L5 finally dropping into place, we can switch back to Duna and clean that up. We still have one more maneuver for Deep Space 2 around Duna, and then I want to do a little bit of scanning around Ike. Sure enough, as you can see in my adjustment of the orbit here, we had far more fuel available to us than I really would have needed. I probably could have changed this orbit all over the place if I had wanted to. I guess we'll just chalk that up to Bill's desire for redundancy. He wanted redundant fuel on the launch. So here we go with the Ike scan, and you can see that we're almost done in this system now. A little bit of scanning, and then we will go and check on the Jool mission. We still have to collect Hadfield's medicine from Jool's atmosphere, and that one is coming up on its time for a mid-course correction to make sure that we can get ourselves down into the atmosphere. So we have flipped around to point at that maneuver node, and now it's time to make that burn. You're going to be seeing how my orbit is coming very close to Jool, and we're looking at it while centered on Jool, which is a really awesome way to see how close you're going to get to something. And people ask me, how do you get that view? Because I don't get that kind of view when I'm playing. Well, if you open your settings.cfg file that's in your Kerbal Space Program directory, there's going to be a line that says conic patch draw mode equals, and most likely yours says something like a 3. Well, set it to a 0 and you'll get exactly this view. Actually, while you're in there, go up a couple lines and you're going to see physics frame DT limit and a number. I've set mine to 0.034 because that matches my upload rate of what I send up to YouTube. But I noticed when I changed it that I actually increased my frames per second in the game as well. So you might want to try out a number like that if you want to see if that'll boost your frames per second up at all. Alright, Kerbonauts, I'm still working on the launcher that's going to take the lander over to the moon to experiment with that harvesting lander that we saw once before but kept on exploding a lot. It's supposed to go to Duna, of course, but we're going to do our reference missions on the moon to learn what we can about what we might want to change before we send the real mission off to Duna. We're just about at the end here. You will notice a distinct lack of interlude this time around. That's because I spent so much time working on that history episode that I didn't really get a lot of chance to play Odyssey this week. I can pretty much only make about one real full-length episode per week of something with a little bit of extra time left over, and normally what I'd been doing is making Odyssey episodes and then throwing 5 or 10 minutes in here and there on my history episode. Eventually, I finally got it done, but it took a while to get it done, and it has been so popular that what I might want to do is spend a real dedicated week to doing another one of those. And if I do that, there's not going to be much of an Odyssey, so maybe we'll have to alternate back and forth. Do one Odyssey, one history, maybe something like that. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, but we'll figure it out as we go along. This is gonna do it for this time. Until next time, I will see you later, Kerbonauts.